In this video, we're going to talk about decimals. As it says here, we can think of a decimal number as a decimal fraction. Well, what is a decimal fraction? Decimal fraction is a fraction in which the denominator, the bottom number, is a number such as 10, 100, 1000, 10,000, so it's basically 1 and so many zeros. As you can see here in this table, all those are decimal fractions. Well, they're mixed numbers, right? Most of them are mixed numbers, but the fractional part is a decimal fraction. So 10, 100, 1000, so see those denominators? So these are decimal fractions. That means that each of those decimal fractions we can convert to a decimal. So let's see how it looks like. So first of all, let's describe this fraction, this decimal fraction in words. Well, it's 5 and 3/10, right? I'm going to write this. 5 and 3/10. Like that. Here's going to be the corresponding decimal. Well, we're going to have the whole part, which is 5. Now, whole part is separated from the decimal part in the decimal by a point. We call it decimal point right here. And then the fraction 3/10 is written as just 3. So this is how we can think about a decimal. The number of digits after the decimal point corresponds to the number of zeros in the denominator. And that's going to be an easy way to convert from one to another. So this fraction has, this denominator has 1 0. Well, this decimal has 1 digit. And if we think that way, we can connect those two. Decimal fraction and a decimal. By the way, we read both of them same way. This decimal is pronounced as 5 and 3/10, same way. How about the next one? This mixed number is 21 and 17/100ths. I will write that. What's going to be the corresponding decimal? Well, the whole part is 21. It's separated from the decimal part by a decimal point. I'm going to write 17. That's the numerator. And I'll make sure that I have 2 digits after the decimal point because I have 2 zeros here. Well, if I write 17, then automatically I'll get those 2 digits. Right, so 2 zeros. That's 2 digits. And since we knew how to read this decimal fraction, well, that means that this decimal is going to be read the same way. This is 21 and 17/100ths. Let's try the next one. The next one is 16 and 243 thousandths. What's the corresponding decimal? 16 is the whole part that's going to be before the decimal point. And then after the decimal point, I'll place 243. I need to make sure that I have 3 digits. Well, it will make those 3 digits. 243. 3 zeros in the denominator correspond to 3 digits in the decimal part. Now, for the next several examples, we're no longer going to write how to pronounce decimal fraction or decimal, which is the same. I think you got the idea, right? Which is going to convert. Let's write this mixed number, including decimal fraction, as a decimal. Well, 7 is a whole part, so it's going to be before the decimal point. And then 9 will be placed in the decimal part. But how many digits do we have to have? Well, we have to have 2 digits, right? Because we have 2 zeros here. 2 zeros. That means that I have to have 2 digits. But I only have 1 to place, right? I only have 9. So first of all, I have to think where to place 9. Well, this is how I'm going to organize that. I'm going to put 9 at the end, and I will use 0 as the placeholder. It's called placeholder. Now, I had to use placeholder because, again, I needed 2 digits after the decimal point because I had 2 zeros. Then why didn't I write 9 and then 0? Well, if I put 9 and then 0, it would be 90. I would write it as 90 100ths, but I don't have 90, I have 9 100ths. So that's why I had to put 9 at the end, so I can read it as 9 hundredths. So this is how conversion happens in this case. Let's try next one. In the next one, notice it's not mixed number anymore, it's just a fraction, a decimal fraction. Since there is no whole part, I can put 0 before the decimal point. I have nothing as the whole number. And then 7/10, I have to have 1 digit after the decimal point, and I have 7. So, right, like that. So 7/10. I want to make a note that it's also acceptable not to write anything in the whole part if we don't have it. So I can simply write it as point and then 7. So 7/10. Both are acceptable and mean the same. Next example, we have 4 and 20 hundredths. So the corresponding decimal will be 4 point. 100 in the denominator means that I have to have 2 digits after the decimal point. Well, but I also have to place 20, and as I place 20, it will create those 2 digits, right? So that's the equivalent decimal. What we're going to do for our last example, we'll continue working with that same number, but let's simplify it a little bit. We're not going to simplify it all the way, but notice that 20 over 100 can be reduced by 10, so I can divide the top and the bottom number by 10. So there is something that I want to show you, and that's why I'm doing this. So I can rewrite this mixed number as 4 and 2 over 10, which is also involving decimal fraction, right? It means that I can also create an equivalent decimal. What kind of decimal is going to be? Well, it's going to be also 4 point, but then since now it's 10 in the denominator, I only have to have 1 digit after the decimal point, well, and that digit will become 2. So 4.2. Here's the point of the last 2 examples. We're looking at the equivalent numbers, right? Those 2 are equal, and that means that the decimals are equal here. But what's the difference between them? Well, one has 0 at the end and one doesn't have 0 at the end. So I'll add note here that they're equal. Right? I just simplified it. Now those 2 are equal as well for that same reason. But what's the difference? As we said, one of them, the second one, doesn't have 0 at the end. That means that 0 at the end does not really play any role. It doesn't really change the number. It doesn't really change the decimal. So this illustrates that 0 at the end of the decimal part can always be dropped if needed. So I'll say you can drop zeros at the end of the decimal. So you can always drop 0 at the end of a decimal number. So that illustrates how decimal fractions and decimal numbers are related and connected. Here's the hint. If you need to read a decimal, which can be sometimes a little bit challenging if you try to use proper language, then think about corresponding fraction, because when number is given in a fraction form, it's a little bit easier to understand how to read it in words. In this example, we need to write each decimal as a fraction. Let's try it. So here's our first decimal. I'm not going to read it out loud because otherwise it's going to be easy to see what the answer is. Instead, let's think this way. When we need to convert decimal to a fraction, then we have to first check if there is a whole part. Well, the whole part is always before the decimal point. Yes, we do have the whole part. So it means that we're going to end up with a mixed number. So the 3 is going to be the whole part of the mixed number. And now what follows after the decimal point, that will be part of the fraction, part of the decimal fraction that we're going to obtain. And that's how I think about it. Okay, I'll make a note that this is 3. This is how I think about it. I need to count the number of digits I have after a decimal point, so it has 2 digits. And that's going to match the number of zeros that I have in the denominator of this fraction. So 2 digits, it means that I'll have 2 zeros, and that means that denominator will be 100. So 2 zeros. And then after that, whatever I had after the decimal point, I have to place in the numerator. So 25. So that's the number we obtained. That's the fraction we obtained. It's 3 and 25 hundredths. So that's a mixed number, I should say. 3 and 25 hundredths. If you can simplify, go ahead and simplify. That's the case here, right? We can divide out 25. So if I divide the numerator by 25 and the denominator by 25, I'll obtain 3 and 1/4. But yeah, that would be the way. Let's try it for example B and C. So in example B, first of all, I observe there is no whole part. There's 0 in front of the decimal point. So this means that we'll only have a fraction here, so it's not a mixed number. Let's start with the denominator. Let's count the number of digits after the decimal point. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 digits after a decimal point. That means that that's how many zeros I will have in the denominator. 1 and 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 zeros. What number is that? 1, 2, 3, comma. Looks like it's 10,000, right? And then all those digits I will place in the numerator. 1, 9, 3, 9. So that makes a decimal fraction that we read as 1,939 10,000ths, right? And that's exactly how we're going to read this decimal. It's exactly the same way. Now that cannot be simplified, so that's the answer. And then last example. Again, no whole part, so it's just going to be a fraction. What will be in the denominator of this fraction? Let's count digits. After the decimal point, I have 1, 2, 3. 3 digits after the decimal point. That means that I'll have that many zeros. 3 digits. So that's how many zeros I will have in the denominator. So it's 1 and 1, 2, 3 zeros. 3 zeros. So that becomes 1,000, right? And then whatever I have here, I have to place in the numerator. Well, I wouldn't say 063, right? It's just 63. So 63 has to be placed in the numerator. How do I read this fraction? It's 63 thousandths. And that's exactly how we would read this decimal, 63 thousandths. It cannot be simplified. That means that this is the final answer. So that's the way to convert decimals to fractions.